Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving deep into Jonathan Edwards. That American philosophical powerhouse from the 18th century. You might have encountered him in a history or religion class, but today we're going beyond the surface. Expert speaker, I'm pumped to unpack this with you. Edwards is often remembered for his fire and brimstone sermons, but his philosophical arguments are surprisingly complex, right?
Absolutely. It's fascinating how he intertwined philosophy and theology, making his ideas relevant even today, especially considering how much our understanding of the world has evolved since his time.
Right. So to set the stage for our listeners, Edwards was a prolific writer, and we've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article about him, along with snippets from his own writings. Our mission today, to understand Edwards' core philosophical beliefs, especially this idea of God's sovereignty, and see how those beliefs connect to his theological ideas. You ready to dive in, expert speaker?
Let's do it. I'm always up for unearthing some philosophical gems.
Okay, so you got some serious philosophical chops. Give me the rundown on what Edwards was all about.
Well, Edwards was wrestling with some huge ideas. Two main themes really stick out: God's sovereignty and the beauty of God's holiness. And to get at these ideas, he went deep into philosophical areas like determinism, occasionalism, and even idealism.
Hold on. Determinism, occasionalism, idealism. You're already dropping some serious philosophy jargon here. Let's make sure our listener is following along. Start with determinism. What exactly did Edwards believe about free will?
Okay, so picture this. Edwards believed that God determines all events, including our choices. That's theological determinism in a nutshell. It's like saying our lives are a play and God is the playwright who's already written the script.
Wait, so if God has already decided everything, what about my choices? My free will? Doesn't that make me a puppet?
That's the question that really bothered a lot of folks even back then. Edwards argued against libertarianism, the idea that we have this completely independent free will, free from God's influence.
So how did Edwards dismantle the idea of totally free will? It seems pretty intuitive to think we make our own choices, right?
It does seem that way, right? But Edwards systematically picked apart that intuition. For instance, he argued against the idea that our choices have no preceding cause, what philosophers call self-determination. If a choice just pops up with no cause, it's basically random, like a coin flip. Edwards argued that you can't really build a system of morality on randomness. How can you praise or blame someone for an action that just happened?
Okay, I'm starting to see his point. But did he just focus on taking down the idea of free will?
Oh no, he had his own reasons for embracing determinism, and those reasons go right to the heart of his concept of God.
All right, let's hear it. Why was Edwards so convinced about determinism?
Well, one of his main arguments was rooted in God's sovereignty. He believed God has absolute control over all things. If that's true, wouldn't God be the ultimate cause of every event, even our choices?
That makes sense. But did he have any other reasons?
He did. He thought determinism lined up better with our everyday idea of moral responsibility.
Wait, hold on. How can we be held accountable if our actions were already set in motion?
Good question. Think about how we usually judge someone's actions. We look at their character, their motives, right? So even in a deterministic world, those things still matter. They're part of the causal chain leading to a choice.
So it's not like our choices are meaningless.
Exactly. And Edwards made this really clever distinction between philosophical necessity and vulgar necessity to explain this. Vulgar necessity is like being forced to do something you absolutely don't want to do, like someone holding a gun to your head.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's this philosophical necessity then?
It's acknowledging that everything has a cause, but it doesn't mean we're puppets. It's more like saying, given your personality experiences and everything that makes you you, your choices flow naturally from that. They're still your choices, even if they're part of a larger predetermined plan.
You're saying Edwards believed we do make choices, but those choices are shaped by who we are, which God ultimately created.
That's a great way to put it. He's emphasizing that our actions are genuine expressions of who we are, even if they're ultimately flowing from God's plan.
Wow, that's a pretty mind-bending concept. It seems like Edwards is threading a very fine needle here. But he wasn't just focused on determinism, was he?
Oh, not at all. He explored all sorts of fascinating ideas. In fact, he argued that not only is the future determined, but the past is necessary too.
Whoa. Okay, you've lost me. Necessary past. What in the world does that even mean?
Here's the thing. Imagine you made a decision yesterday. Edwards believed that since God is all-knowing, he's always known you'd make that decision.
Okay, but does that mean it was inevitable, like set in stone from the beginning of time?
Exactly. Since God can't be wrong, his knowledge of your past decision means it couldn't have happened any other way. Because God's knowledge of that past event is now fixed. Nothing you do in the present can change it. Therefore, the decision becomes necessary.
All right, now I'm really feeling the brain burn.
Hmm.
But he brings up a great point. If God is all-knowing, doesn't that mean he's always known every choice we'd make?
Right. And to drive his point home even further, Edwards brought in the idea of divinely inspired prophecies.
Prophecies. How do those fit into this picture?
Well, even if God's knowledge is timeless, prophecies uttered in the past are not. They are fixed in the past, but they're clearly about events that happen later. Edwards argued that these prophecies demonstrate that those future events are already necessary.
I'm seeing how all of these ideas are connected. God's sovereignty, determinism, the necessity of the past. It's like a philosophical puzzle.
But didn't Edwards also have some pretty radical views about reality itself?
He did. Are you ready to dive into the world of occasionalism and idealism?
Bring it on, listener. Get ready to have your mind blown.
All right, let's tackle occasionalism first. It's this radical idea that God is the only real cause in the universe.
Wait, so you're telling me that when I stub my toe on a chair, it's not really the chair's fault? God's the one who made me stub my toe.
That's how Edwards saw it. He'd say what we think of as cause and effect is actually just God directly causing things to happen. He believed that things like gravity or the laws of physics are just occasions for God to act, not causes in themselves. We trying to wrap my head around this. So it's like God is a cosmic puppeteer, and the laws of nature are the strings. But how did Edwards justify this idea? Isn't it kind of obvious that things have their own causal powers?
Well, Edwards was a master at challenging assumptions. He pointed out that there's always this tiny gap between what we think of as a cause and its effect. Think about a billiard ball hitting another one. There's a split second where they touch, and then the second ball starts moving.
I see. So there's that instant where the first ball hitting is seemingly separate from the effect, the second ball moving.
Right. And Edwards used this gap to argue that what we call secondary causes, like the force of the first ball hitting, can't be true causes. For him, a true cause must be simultaneous with its effect and have the power to make that effect happen.
So only God can bridge that gap because he's outside of time and space.
Exactly. And Edwards also argued that if things in the world could truly cause other things, then wouldn't that make God's actions redundant? That wouldn't make sense if God is all-powerful.
Okay, I can see how occasionalism fits with Edwards' overall emphasis on God's sovereignty. It's like everything that happens is a direct expression of God's will. But I'm guessing occasionalism wasn't even the most radical idea he had.
Oh, you know Edwards. If you thought occasionalism was wild, buckle up for idealism.
Okay, hit me with it. What's this idealism all about?
Idealism, at least Edwards' version of it, basically claims that the material world doesn't exist independently of minds.
Hold on, are you saying that if I close my eyes, everything around me disappears? Does that coffee mug over there just cease to exist?
Not quite. Edwards wouldn't say things pop out of existence when we're not looking. He'd say their ultimate reality is mental, that they exist as ideas in God's mind. We perceive them as physical objects because God is causing us to have those perceptions.
So you're saying that mug exists as an idea in God's mind, and he's projecting that idea into my mind, kind of like a divine movie projector.
That's a good analogy. And Edwards makes a really interesting argument for this. He says everything we know about an object comes down to simple ideas like color, shape, texture. What do you experience when you look at that mug?
Well, I see its shape, its color, I feel its weight.
Right, and Edwards would say all those qualities are ultimately mental experiences in our minds. He even argued that something like motion is just a series of perceptions of an object at different points in time.
So the mug itself isn't really moving, it's just that God is making me perceive it as moving. My mind is creating that sense of movement.
Exactly. And since all the qualities we perceive are mental, he concluded that the object itself must also be mental. It exists as an idea in God's mind, which he then makes us perceive.
Okay, I can kind of see how he got there.
Mm.
It's a pretty wild idea, though, right? Is he saying the world is an illusion? How is this different from just saying God created everything?
He's not saying the world is fake, more like it's fundamentally mental. He saw God as not just the ultimate cause, but the ultimate substance, the ground of all being. It's all stemming from God's mind.
Wow, it's like his idealism is the natural next step from occasionalism. If God's causing all our perceptions, then why wouldn't the objects of those perceptions also depend on God?
Precisely. It all goes back to his central theme of God's absolute sovereignty. And this exploration of such radical ideas led him to an even more profound concept, God as being in general.
Being in general. Oh, okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me and for our listener out there who might be thinking, what in the philosophical world are these guys talking about?
This is where Edwards' metaphysics gets really interesting. He's saying that God is the sum of all being, that all things exist in him and he in all.
Now, that sounds a bit pantheistic, doesn't it? Like God and the universe are just one big blob.
It's understandable why someone might think that. But Edwards was careful to distinguish his view from pantheism. He's not saying God is the universe. Instead, he's emphasizing God's absolute power. All things depend on God for their very existence and their properties.
So it's more like all of creation is an expression of God's being, but not literally a part of God himself.
That's a good way to think about it. Edwards used the analogy of shadows and images to describe the relationship between God and creation.
Shadows and images. I like that. It suggests that we're reflections of God's reality, but not the full picture. But what about our minds? Are we just shadows too?
That's where it gets even more nuanced. Edwards said that minds, while still dependent on God, are more like images of God because they have a kind of agency, even though they don't have true power. He saw physical objects as mere shadows because they lack both agency and consciousness.
So we're like slightly more defined shadows.
More like reflections. Think of it as a hierarchy. You've got God at the top, the source of all reality. Then you've got minds as images of God, reflecting some of his attributes. And finally, you have physical objects as mere shadows, the most basic level of existence.
Okay, I'm starting to get a glimpse of what Edwards meant by being in general. It's this interconnected system with God as the source of it all. But if God is so perfect and self-sufficient, why create anything at all? What's the point?
That is the age-old question, isn't it? Why would a perfect being create? And Edwards actually had some pretty interesting answers.
All right, don't leave us hanging, expert speaker. Spill the beans. What did Edwards think God was up to when he created the universe?
Well, like many theologians before him, Edwards believed that God created the world for his own glory. But he dug deeper into what that really means.
So it's not just God sitting on a cloud demanding praise.
Not exactly. He saw God's glory as this outward expression of his internal perfections, like his holiness and benevolence. It's like this overflowing goodness that spills out into creation.
So by creating the world, God is kind of showing off how awesome he is.
In a way, yes, but it's more than just bragging. It's about revealing something essential about his nature. And Edwards identified 4 main aspects of God's glory that are on display in creation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
First, there's the exercise of God's perfections to produce something truly amazing. It's like God using his infinite power and wisdom to create a masterpiece.
Like an artist putting their heart and soul into a painting.
Exactly. Then there's a manifestation of God's glory to created beings. It's like God is saying, look at what I've made. Can you believe this awesomeness?
So creation is like this grand stage where God's glory is on full display.
I like that analogy. And then there's the communication of God's fullness to his creatures. This is where it gets really interesting. Edwards believed that God's goodness is so overflowing that he naturally wants to share it, to communicate his joy and love to others.
So creation is partly motivated by God's desire for connection, for sharing his happiness.
Exactly. And the final aspect is how creatures respond to God's glory, their esteem, love, joy, and worship.
Okay, so this is where the traditional idea of praising God comes in.
Yes. But Edwards saw this response as more than just an obligation. He believed it's actually a crucial part of God's glory itself. It's like when a musician creates a beautiful piece of music. The audience's appreciation completes the experience.
Wow, that's a really beautiful way to think about it. So God created for his own glory, but that glory includes our happiness and our response to him. It's all interconnected.
Precisely. And it gets even more intriguing when we consider Edwards' belief that God also created for the creature's happiness.
Wait a minute. Didn't you just say God created for his own glory? Now you're saying he also created for our happiness? How does that work?
It does seem like a contradiction at first, but Edwards found a clever way to reconcile those two ideas. Remember how he defined happiness? It's the knowledge and love of God, and the joy that comes from that knowledge and love.
Right. It's about being connected to God.
Exactly. And since God's ultimate goal is to communicate his glory, which involves us knowing and loving him, our happiness becomes a natural part of that purpose.
So it's not like God has 2 separate to-do lists, one for his glory and one for our happiness. They're intertwined.
Exactly. And this leads to another fascinating question. If God always does what's fittest and best, did he have to create this specific world? Could he have created a different one?
Okay, now we're getting into some deep theological territory. Help us navigate this, expert speaker.
It's a question that has puzzled theologians for centuries. Edwards seemed to lean towards the idea that God's nature compels him to create, to share his goodness. And since he always chooses what's best, the world he created must be the best possible world.
But wouldn't that mean God wasn't really free to choose? If he had to create this world, doesn't that limit his options?
Edwards had a nuanced view of freedom. He didn't see it as the ability to do anything whatsoever, but rather as the ability to act in accordance with one's own nature and will without any outside pressure.
So God is free because he's acting out of his own goodness and love, not because he's forced to do something he doesn't want to.
Exactly. Edwards believed that God could have created countless possible worlds, but he freely chose this one because it aligned with his perfect nature.
That's a really thought-provoking perspective on God's freedom in creation. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. From determinism to occasionalism to idealism, Edwards had some truly radical ideas. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing, his ideas on virtue and beauty.
Definitely. That's another area where Edwards really shines. He had some really unique insights into what makes something truly virtuous and truly beautiful.
Well, don't leave our listener in suspense. What were some of those insights?
Edwards believed that true virtue is rooted in benevolence and love. But not just any kind of love. For him, it wasn't enough to just love your family or your friends or even all of humanity. True virtue for Edwards is benevolence towards being in general.
Being in general. There's that phrase again. So it's not about loving specific beings, but loving the very essence of existence itself.
You got it. It's this incredibly expansive concept of love that includes everything in creation, even God himself. Edwards argued that true virtue is about aligning our will with God's will, which is ultimately directed toward the good of all being.
Wow, that's a really challenging idea. To expand our circle of compassion, to include not just people, but all living things, even inanimate objects.
Yeah.
Because they all participate in this grand scheme of being in general.
It's a profound shift in perspective, and it leads to a fascinating understanding of beauty. Edwards didn't think true beauty was just about aesthetics, about pretty colors or pleasing shapes. He saw true beauty as a reflection of true virtue.
So a beautiful sunset or a stunning painting is just a surface-level kind of beauty.
He called that secondary beauty. It's a reflection of the harmony and order that God built into the world. But primary beauty, true beauty, is found in this consent of being to being, which is ultimately rooted in God's love.
So true beauty is less about what we see with our eyes and more about what we feel in our hearts.
Yeah.
A recognition of this deep interconnectedness of all things.
Exactly. And this leads to one of Edwards' most interesting ideas, the sense of the heart. He believed that we have this special faculty, a spiritual sense, that allows us to perceive the beauty of holiness.
A sense of the heart. That sounds almost mystical. How does this spiritual sense work?
Edwards believed that this sense goes beyond our five senses and even beyond reason. It's a direct intuition of spiritual truth, a kind of knowing that's grounded in love.
So it's not about logic or reasoning. It's more about feeling and intuition.
Precisely. He described it as a taste or a relish, that feeling of delight you get when you experience something truly beautiful. He said this sense is a gift from God through the Holy Spirit.
So not everyone has this sense. Only those who have been touched by God's grace.
That was his view. He believed that someone who hasn't experienced God's grace can appreciate the beauty of nature or art, but they can't fully grasp the beauty of holiness.
So true spiritual understanding requires a transformed heart, a heart that's been open to God's love.
Exactly. But even though Edwards emphasized this sense of the heart, he wasn't against reason. He actually saw it as an essential tool.
Okay, so how does reason fit into the picture if we have this special spiritual sense?
Edwards believed that reason is essential for understanding Scripture and for making sense of the world around us. But he also argued that reason needs to be sanctified by grace. It needs to be illuminated by the sense of the heart to fully grasp spiritual truths.
So it's not reason or spiritual sense, it's both working together.
Exactly. He believed that reason without grace can lead to cold, sterile knowledge, and grace without reason can lead to blind faith. It's the combination of both that allows us to see the world truly as it is, as this awe-inspiring expression of God's beauty and love.
Wow, expert speaker. That was quite a deep dive into Jonathan Edwards. From his complex arguments for determinism to his mind-bending ideas about occasionalism and idealism, Edwards really challenged conventional philosophical and theological thinking.
Yeah.
But what really struck me was his emphasis on being general, This idea that everything in creation is interconnected and ultimately finds its source in God. It makes you think about the world in a whole new way, doesn't it?
It really does. And even though his ideas might seem a bit radical at times, they offer a profound perspective on our relationship with God, with each other, and with the world around us.
I completely agree. And for our listeners out there, what are your thoughts on Edwards' ideas? Do they resonate with you, challenge you? We'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, keep diving deep into the big questions and exploring the fascinating world of ideas.